Welcome everybody to my talk on China's central bank digital currency. First and foremost, I would like to thank Israel FinTech Week for inviting me to this amazing event. My name is Dr. Oriol Caudevilla, and I hope you enjoy my talk. I'm going to proceed now by sharing my PowerPoint so you can all see my research on this topic. So basically, throughout this half an hour, I'm going to talk to you about China's central bank digital currency, also known as digital yuan or DCP, as we're going to see later. And as you can see here, my subtitle is The Start of a New Era, and I'm going to explain why I think so. This is an index of the main areas I'm going to cover throughout this seminar, which I intend to make as brief as possible, but as informative as possible as well. So about myself, as I said before, my name is Dr. Oriol Caudevilla. Even though I have a background in law, I've focused these last few years towards finance and this amazing fintech world. And well, I'm currently involved in several projects, but when it comes to central bank digital currencies, I've already given a few webinars and seminars on this topic, and I'm doing extensive research on that. I think it's a very interesting topic, and it's the future in many ways. You're going to see next a summary of this topic. So basically, in April this year, after several years of work, the Chinese government announced the starting of the tests of the so-called DCP, Digital Currency Electronic Payment, in 4 cities. DCP is the name of China's central bank digital currency. So every time you see throughout my presentation that I talk about China CBDC or DCP or even digital yuan, I'm actually talking about the same thing. It's very important to keep that in mind. So as I was saying, China started to test that DCP in 4 cities in April. After that, China started by expanding those tests in a few other areas, including the Greater Bay Area, as well as Beijing and Shanghai. Those tests are going to start soon. The idea that China has is to completely deploy this CBDC by the Winter Olympic Games in Beijing in 2022, so in less than 2 years from now. I need to start by talking about some basic concepts that I think that it is important for all of us to keep into consideration. First of all, what's central bank money in general? Well, central bank money is a legal tender issued by a central bank. So it's basically a claim against that bank. Central bank money is used for both wholesale payments and retail payments. So I think that so far this is something very basic. Central bank digital currencies are, of course, a kind of central bank money, a digital kind, to put it this way. A CBDC is, as I said, a new form of central bank money accessible to the general public. It's accepted as a means of payment, as legal tender, as a safe store of value by all citizens, businesses, and government agencies. A CBDC should as well enable cheap, secure, and real-time transactions, transfers of value. It should also be accessible without a bank account. And it should be built on an open infrastructure to foster both competition and innovation. That's the idea, that's the theory behind the CBDCs. Then some other CBDC-related key aspects are the next ones that you can see in this slide. So basically, CBDCs are, by its own very definition, digital. And then there is this element of liability of a central bank as well, which is related to what I said before. CBDCs as well have some optional features, such as transparency. It can be full or limited, records of transfers and holdings, convertibility, holders, etc. What are the possible motivations behind CBDCs? Well, I could cite many here, but I think those in this slide are like the main ones. So basically, one of the ideas or motivations behind CBDCs are to replace physical banknotes. Another one is for monetary policy purposes. So basically, for example, to reduce the lower bound on interest rates. Also, CBDCs can be used as a tool to improve financial stability. Also, CBDCs are motivated sometimes by purely technological or innovation reasons. Also, the reason behind those is a reason of global geopolitics. And also, sometimes there is this motivation of financial crime prevention. Well, I think that for most central banks, the motivations are a combination of all those that I just mentioned. It's very important to remark, though, that in the same way that I've mentioned several times in my articles, that COVID-19, this pandemic, is turbocharging a FinTech revolution. COVID-19 is also speeding up this CBDC revolution, to put it this way. And I think it's like that because, I mean, it's true that many central banks started to test their CBDCs years ago. I mean, I already mentioned that China started to do research on CBDCs in 2014. I mean, almost 7 years ago, 6 years and a half ago. But still, I think that the thing that is actually encouraging most central banks and governments to speed up their tests is precisely this trend towards a much more virtual and digital world due to this COVID-19 pandemic. I think that this pandemic is actually speeding up this. CBDCs were going to come no matter what someday, but I think that maybe they're going to come like 2, 3, 4, 5 years earlier than expected due partially to this pandemic that we are all living. I think it's also very important to remark that CBDCs are not cryptocurrencies. Many people tend to be confused about this idea, and they try to consider that CBDCs are one kind more of cryptos, and that's not entirely true. CBDCs are not cryptos. CBDCs are purely, what I said before, a digital form of traditional money. So in reality, the idea behind CBDC is actually the opposite from the idea behind cryptos. And it is so because, as you can see in this slide, CBDCs are per se centralized, while cryptocurrencies are per se decentralized. The idea behind cryptocurrencies is precisely this idea of creating a digital asset that cannot be I'm not going to say cannot be controlled, but an asset that guarantees to a larger extent, anonymity, etc. While CBDCs are actually the opposite. A CBDC is nothing else but a digital form of, in that case, the yuan or the euro, issued by a central bank and controlled or regulated by a central bank. So it's very different from a cryptocurrency, from, for example, Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc. Of course, they are somewhat related. I mean, for example, as you can see in this slide as well, CBDCs take some elements from cryptocurrencies, like, for example, the convenience and security, etc. No? But when it comes to the main concept, it's different. It's different, a CBDC from a cryptocurrency. So it's not right to consider CBDCs as a kind of cryptocurrencies. It's not like that. But as I said before, CBDCs may bear some similarities with cryptocurrencies. And in this slide, I'm focusing on the digital yuan case. Like, for example, even though a CBDC, China's digital yuan, is not a cryptocurrency, and even though China's CBDC is not blockchain-based, it doesn't mean that there are not some common features, which you can see in here. For example, both China's digital yuan and cryptos use online and hardware wallets, as you can see in here, to securely store private keys of chain. That's one important similarity between both. Also, both China's digital yuan and cryptocurrencies use a two-key architecture system to secure transactions. I think that these two similarities are quite important. Those two similarities are more technical, much more detailed than what I said before, but I think it's very important to bear those in mind. So I think a good summary that you could make in here is that CBDCs and cryptos, as I said before, are not the same. Both of them actually come from an opposite philosophy, but at the same time, the technical architecture behind some CBDCs, like the digital yuan, may have some similarities with cryptocurrencies. As I said before, a CBDC doesn't necessarily need to be based on blockchain technology. I think that's another important concept to explain here. Basically, blockchain technology is a technology, but many people tend to confuse blockchain with cryptos. So blockchain would be like the bigger category. It's a technology that can be applied to cryptocurrencies, to trade finance, to many other banking operations, to health, blockchain has countless applications. Bitcoins and the rest of cryptocurrencies use blockchain to underpin their operations. Okay, so that's the idea. CBDCs are not a cryptocurrency, as I said before. And CBDCs may or may not use blockchain. As you can see here on my slide, CBDCs don't need blockchain, but they might be compatible with a blockchain. And sometimes, actually, it's going to be useful for CBDCs to use blockchain. It's normally considered by most experts working on CBDCs in central banks and blockchain-related companies that blockchain could be useful for wholesale CBDCs, while it's not so useful for retail CBDCs. That's pretty much the idea right now. China's digital yuan is going to be operating through a two-tier structure in which the People's Bank of China, which is China's central bank, will issue the digital currency to commercial banks and institutions without the employment of blockchain technology. But the financial institutions could give out the digital yuan to the public through blockchain. So that's why, as I said before, we can neither affirm nor deny that China's digital yuan is going to use blockchain technology. It's going to use blockchain to a limited extent. So that's why CBDCs and blockchain are not incompatible. They are actually compatible, but we cannot affirm that CBDCs are going to be entirely based on blockchain technology. I think that's the main idea that you need to get here from this slide. Right now, I'm going to talk about CBDCs around the world. It's very important to remark in here that even though I'm talking about China's digital yuan, actually, according to a report published by the Bank of International Settlements in early 2020, 80% of central banks throughout the world are already conducting some kind of work on CBDCs. In some cases, that work is very initial, like, for example, some very initial research. In some other cases, like, for example, China, that research and even that testing is well advanced. Or there are cases like, for example, the Bahamas, which is, to the best of my knowledge, the most advanced case in the world, where they actually already deployed their own central bank digital currency, the dollar cent in Bahamas. China, though, might become the first major economy in the world to deploy its own CBDC. That's very important. It's very important to realize that China is much more advanced than most countries, but also to bear in mind that most central banks are interested in CBDCs, at least are interested in doing some research. It doesn't mean that all of them are going to eventually deploy their own CBDC. And as I mentioned before, COVID-19 is turbocharging digitalization and a much more virtual world. So that's why if 80% of central banks were already conducting research or studies on CBDCs in early 2020, I expect this figure to go up and up soon, because COVID-19, as I said before, is turbocharging everything related to a much more virtual world. So that's why this amount and this interest for CBDCs is certainly going to go up and up. You can see on this slide some CBDC project status, but as I said before, there are many throughout the world. For the purpose of that report that I mentioned before, the Bank of International Settlements made a differentiation regarding the nature of the CBDC to be ushered in by central banks. You can read that part in here. I'm not going to dwell much more on that because I need to make it to the part about the digital yuan, but still I think it's interesting for you to keep that slide. Nevertheless, even though, as I said before, 80% of central banks are already conducting some kind of research or work on CBDCs, Asia seems to be the place in the world where CBDCs are out more interest. The list of countries in Asia already doing research or some kind of more advanced work on CBDCs is quite long. Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Philippines, as well as Japan and Korea. Regarding South Korea, for example, the Bank of Korea recently announced last month, on October 7, that they are going to start a pilot phase of their own CBDC in 2021, in early 2021, actually, according to some information published by the Korea Times. The goal of this pilot is precisely to test whether their own CBDC can finally be launched or not. Same applies to Japan, for example. The Bank of Japan published a press release just 2 days after the one from Korea, announcing that in 2021, in early 2021, they are going to start their own CBDC tests as well. I think that even though both central banks, the Bank of Korea and the Bank of Japan, already wanted to do that for long, the fact of seeing China so advanced has encouraged them to speed up their own tests. Throughout my latest slides, I tried to provide you with a brief introduction to this amazing world of CBDCs. Right now, I'm going to finally talk to you a bit more about China's digital yuan. I'm going to analyze this digital yuan or DCP, as well as its potential opportunities. So, as I said before, Beijing is creating its own state-run digital currency, CBDC. The research started a few years ago, and that pilot phase is being extended to a few other areas throughout China. As we speak, I mean, this is expanding like very fast. China would be, if successful, the first major economy in deploying its own CBDC, finally successful, as I said. Aside from any monetary policy reason, and aside from any of these more economic-related reasons, China's interest in its own CBDC may also come from the fact that this digital yuan is going to provide China with a clear leverage, a clear advantage. It's going to be a platform for China to increase its influence throughout the world. China's never been capable of fighting against the supremacy of the US dollar as the main international currency. China has never managed to make its RMB much more international. In that sense, this battle has always been won by the US. But the digital yuan may perhaps start to challenge the status quo of the US dollar a bit. I mean, it's not going to change overnight. The US dollar has been used like an international means of payment for long. This is not going to change like from one day to the other, but still digital yuan may have a profound geopolitical impact. As you can see in here, the People's Bank of China, which is China's central bank, as I said, developed a digital wallet app. You can see some images of this app in here in this slide. Same here. As I said before, the digital yuan is structured on a two-tier monetary system. There is a central bank the People's Bank of China, issuing digital currency for commercial banks, and also a commercial bank issued digital currency focused on the public, which is intended to replace some of China's monetary base or cash in circulation. How is it working so far? Well, it's working well so far. Actually, that's the reason why those tests were extended from those 4 initial cities to the rest of regions that I mentioned before, such as the Greater Bay Area, the Beijing zone, the Shanghai area. And this is so because those tests are actually working very well so far. The idea is for everyone to use those that digital currency, actually. I mean, even American companies with branches in China are starting to use those in those cities where the CBDC was tested, like, for example, Shenzhen. McDonald's, Starbucks already use that as part of the test. So as you can see, it's going to be widely deployed. It's not only going to be focused, for example, to, let's say, payments, to civil servants only. No, it's going to be used like widely by all the citizens if successfully launched in the end. Where are we now? So it's basically what I said before already. Those tests are going to be expanded to those 4 different areas that you can see in here. This new digital yuan is actually a way for China to accelerate its approach towards what they call a dual circulation system. Dual circulation and domestic circulation are phrases that have been trending in the Chinese media lately because they refer to the latest strategy by President Xi Jinping that focuses on the domestic market and overseas markets equally, and perhaps leaning towards a greater attention and resources to the domestic market and domestic demand. So that's the idea behind the dual circulation, and the CBDC is actually a good step towards that. As I said before as well, China seeks to have its digital currency deployed by the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. It's going to be easier for China, though, to deploy its own central bank digital currency because Chinese people they already tend to make payments through mobile devices instead of using cash. Actually, 83% of digital payments in China were made through digital mobile devices compared to just 17% through cash or bank cards. So it's always going to be much easier to deploy a virtual currency, a central bank digital currency, in a place where people are already used to using, to making payments through mobile phone apps, than in a country where, for example, people are still used to just pay with coins and notes. The mentality of the citizens in each country is very important. In that sense, China was already very advanced before these tests that I'm talking about now. DCP, same as both central bank digital currencies, will be able to help to accelerate the move to a cashless society, to a much more inclusive society as well, if you want to put it that way. I'm not going to dwell on this slide because it's pretty much what I said before. What are China's DCP's main advantages? Well, first of all, as I said before as well, it will allow China to create a very important soft power tool. China lacked a soft power tool of this kind for years. As I said before, China has never been able to challenge the US dollar when it comes to having like an international strong currency. China CBDC may actually change that to some extent. China has like a unique opportunity to leverage its own digital yuan cross-border, to expand it cross-border in order to encourage cross-border transactions with the digital yuan. Cross-border transactions with China's digital yuan will be able to be conducted, for example, as part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which encompasses many countries throughout Central Asia. It could be also leveraged to encompass China's investments in Africa, for example, which have been quite relevant these last few years. And it could also be leverage as part of China the newest RCEP, this huge free trade agreement that was signed on November 15. China can actually take advantage of this international agreement and can use it as a way to facilitate cross-border transactions with digital yuan. It will also help China to control or minimize its shadow banking system. The system of shadow banking has been for long a problem for China in many ways. I'm not going to dwell on this idea for long, but it's going to allow China to control that. It will also cut down money printing costs, which is obvious, but I think it's important to remark this as well. If there is no note, there is no need to print them. If you don't need to print them, there is no money invested in doing that. So I think that's important, especially for a country as big as China. And also, DCP has other advantages, like, for example, for commercial banks, DCP will facilitate more money transactions with lower costs, while for the public, DCP could save them indirect transaction fees for interbank transfers. So, as you can see, it all seems to be advantages, at least to me. I'm going to analyze this very briefly, this part on DCP and shadow banking. System of shadow banking has been a problem for the Chinese financial system, an important problem actually for these last few years. DCP will actually help China to control or minimize its shadow banking system. Shadow banking was tolerated to some extent by China as a way of meeting the funding that most small and medium enterprises needed before. But as I said before, this shadow banking system is actually tricky. So a central bank digital currency issued by the People's Bank of China is actually going to be a good way for China to tackle this issue. As I said before, China's efforts towards creating a much more controllable and transparent system will eventually help China to control its shadow banking system. But I think perhaps I should have started by this before, but still, I'm talking about shadow banking, and perhaps not all of you are aware of what shadow banking actually implies. Shadow banking, despite using this word shadow, doesn't necessarily need to be shady or hidden. Shadow banking makes reference to that credit intermediation that takes place outside the conventional banking system. It's been in China to some extent, as I said before, tolerated by the authorities, and sometimes those shadow banking activities were actually performed by the very own banks. It wasn't like done by any other company. Sometimes it was done by the very own banks. The idea, though, behind shadow banking is that its members, these activities, are not subject to regulatory oversight. So that's what makes shadow banking actually more dangerous for the Chinese financial system. Shadow banking is not illegal per se. It's nothing like illegal or shady, as I said before, but it's not subject to the regulatory oversight of the regulators, which means that it might be dangerous to some extent. As I said before, China's shadow banking system has been a problem. It was tolerated, but it has been a problem. For example, products like the wealth management products have been sold very commonly in China these last few years. DCP is actually going to be a great way for China to tackle this. So, as I said before, the penetration of mobile payments in China is huge, much higher than most other countries. Some differences that the digital yuan has with other existing payment apps are the fact that a low-value transaction can actually go through even if both parties are offline. This is very important. This is something that most cryptos, for example, do not have. You need to be online. With China's DCP, you won't need to be online. That's something very important. The big four lenders, which are the four biggest banks in China, and later on perhaps FinTech companies in China as well, will distribute the tokens, but the funds won't actually reside in bank accounts. In this slide, you can see a brief comparison between China's DCP, Facebook's Libra, and, for example, Bitcoin, which is one of the most representative kinds of cryptocurrencies that exist. Focusing, for example, in China's DCP, you can see that you know by whom it was created. It was created by China, of course. It's centralized as any other central bank digital currency, because CBDCs by its own definition are centralized. The total supply of this is going to be unlimited, and it's going to be backed, of course, by China's yuan or RMB. While, for example, Bitcoin, just to put an example, was created by Satoshi, who actually no one knows who that person is or was. It's decentralized because the very own idea of Bitcoin, as well as most cryptocurrencies, is this idea of being decentralized. The total supply, though, is limited, and the backing value is energy. So as you can see, there are many clear differences with China's DCP. This is another graph, basically dwelling on the same idea. I think the most important part that you need to get from this slide is that China's DCP is not decentralized, supports offline payment, as I said, and the transaction speed, as you can see here, is going to be very fast. So, with all of that, I'm finally arriving to the conclusions. If China's DCP proves to be viable, China will become the first major economy to introduce a central bank digital currency. As I said before, the Bahamas, for example, have already introduced their own CBDC. But when it comes to major economies, none of them is as advanced as China yet. Actually, the US hasn't shown a big interest so far in creating a digital US dollar. They're talking about that, but they are not entirely sure about that. And when it comes to Europe, these last few weeks, we've heard Christine Lagarde, for example, talking about the idea of a digital euro, and we're interested in doing so in Europe. So we are moving there. But it's going to take us much longer than China, because China started much before most other major economies. So that's going to imply a breakthrough in many ways. Many other countries are not only going to follow China's lead, they are already doing that, actually, because, as I said before, Korea, Japan, many other Asian countries are already about to test their own CBDCs in early 2021. It doesn't mean that they started to do so initially, like years ago, because of China, but they are definitely speeding up their tests because of China's situation, because of China being so advanced in that sense. So I think that's good. I think that China being so advanced is not only good for China, but it's also good for the rest of countries, because it's forcing them to invest much more efforts in their own CBDCs. And to me, CBDCs are the present, but mostly the future. As I said before as well, one of the biggest trade deals in history, the RCEP, was signed on November 15. And this is going to pave the way for the expansion of China's digital yuan. It's clearly going to be like that. Of course, since other countries like Korea and Japan, Thailand are already part of this agreement, it's also going to pave the way for them to expand their own digital currencies. It doesn't mean that RCEP is only going to serve China's purposes. It's going to serve all of them. But since China is more advanced, China is going to be able to take advantage of that situation earlier, much before the other countries. This is pretty much what I just said. China has a clear advantage due to its situation. So basically, just to sum up, China did not invent CBDCs, but China is much more advanced than any other country when it comes to testing and deploying its own CBDC. I think it's going to be the start of a new era, an era which is not created necessarily by China, but it's led by China. A fascinating era where we're going to see most central banks moving towards a much more digital world, a world where coins and notes are going to be left behind, because COVID-19 has shown us that not only coins and notes might be impractical for health and safety purposes, it's also because it doesn't make any sense if we can do like most things online, not to see our central banks deploying a virtual currency, which is going to be nothing else but the euro that we, or the yuan, or the dollar that we already use every day, but in a digital form. That's going to be a breakthrough in many ways. Thank you very much for attending my talk. It's been a pleasure. If any one of you wants to ask me any question or make any remark about my talk, feel free to reach out to me, for example, via LinkedIn. Thank you very much for your time.